It's great to be here again. I've been here before, and the Pennsylvania branch of the IDA has always been a leader. And I'm amazed that I'm surrounded by a lot of old friends as well. I'll talk a little bit about them as I go through this talk. But, you know, as Julia mentioned, I am moving, or have been actually studying more of the basic science of what we call PTSD and stuff like that. Reason being, I'm a veteran. And Jay in front of me here is a veteran. That's what actually we were talking about. And to Jay's right is Emerson Dickman, and Emerson's a veteran. And Emerson was an officer. I was a sergeant, and so I've always had this latent hostility toward him. But it's a good time in my life where I can help people that served and gave a lot, and so that's what I'm doing. But I brought a lot of the things I've learned in studying reading and to the new work I'm doing, and I'm going to miss reading. I'm not going to miss how crazy people are in this field, you know? Have you ever noticed? Sometimes it's weird. I mean, people get medieval on each other. And so, you know, it's always been a dream of mine that science could help adjudicate some of these kind of debates, you know, that people have. Because if we just, you know, frankly, from a common sense perspective, if we just ask, okay, what's working? And if it's working, let's do that. That would solve a lot of the problems. And fortunately, what's working is what, you know, Woodland School actually does. It's what Barbara Wilson, who is a tremendous pioneer in reading instruction, has done. Barbara's group, the Wilson Reading System, is the first. Are you a publisher? No, you're not a vendor. You never say Barbara's a vendor because they don't have a sales force or anything like that. You know how people can really take your ear off if they're selling stuff? But she never does that. She just lets the work go along, you know? And she's the first that has developed a research program within her shop, within the Wilson Reading Company. They have their own research director and so forth and so on. Now that takes a lot of courage because sometimes what we think might work for certain kids may not have an effect like you might think. And you have to shift and you have to adjust. But that's what science is all about. Now I'll talk a little bit about a gentleman over here, and what I mean is a real gentleman, Bob Sweet, who taught me everything I know about you know, the agony of legislation and how to move that kind of stuff through. He's one of the bravest men I know, but I'll weave all that in. And so my wife, Diane, has been my savior in my life. She's a parent. We have a dyslexic youngster who's now a lawyer. Why he would want to do that, who knows? But the boy couldn't read worth a lick, so... And Diane, she doesn't mind me saying it, she can't read worth a lick, still can't. But they're both so highly gifted in so many ways. And so anyway, sometimes I wonder why I get asked to do these things. And I think it's because, you know, I can tell some humorous stories maybe. Because from where I sit, and as I reflect back on about 35 years of this work, which it's been, I'm more of a spokesperson or a cheerleader or something. You're going to see in a little bit the vast network of scientists that all contributed and collaborated together to make all of the knowledge we have available to all of us. I did a little bit of it, but not the lion's share. So when people say, well, it's Reid's research, it's not my research at all. It belongs to you all. We have always been servants of you all the parents in this room who are the real heroes along with their kids. The research is in service to you, and the research is in service to our teachers who really work extraordinarily hard sometimes in places where they're not reinforced to do that, and they have to take a lot of heat. And we're in service, again, to reiterate, for the kids. And this school is a prime example of an institution, an organization that has done wonderful work on the behalf of kids, from little kids all the way up through high school and getting them ready for college. So Woodland is really a beacon of excellence. And Chris, I want to thank you for that. So I'm supposed to have one of these things, and I do. Now the next question is, watch me screw it up. Yeah, okay. So, you know, one of the things that is the most disappointing to me is what I'm going to show you now. In the country, at least in 2011, we still were seeing an extraordinary number of kids not able to read a simple children's book. So nationally, in the 4th grade, look at the percentage, 69% of kids whose second language is English, whose first language is something other than English, are below basic. That's on the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. That's compared to the nation as a whole, where 33% of our kids at the 4th grade cannot read well enough to comprehend, relate new information to known information, and so on. 33%. A lot of us have worked years and years and years with families and youngsters who, by no fault of their own, come up from environments where there's not a lot of money. There's not a lot of resources. There's not a lot of books in the home. There's not a lot of dinner table conversation. There's not an awareness sometimes of how important it is to read to kids and so forth. 50% of our low-income kids at that 8, 9-year-old level read below basic. They can't read a simple children's book. White kids fare a little bit better, but that's still unconscionable. African American kids, high percentage, American Indian, and Hispanic. Now what you'll notice, and you'll see the trends as I go through this, is the minority subgroups all have the same basic percentage as the low-income subgroup. And all of that is to say it doesn't have anything to do with race and ethnicity. It has everything to do with poverty. There's just a high relationship, a high correlation between subgroups, minority subgroups, and how much money is available to families in these subgroups. See what I'm saying? It has nothing to do with race, ethnicity. If you look nationally at the 8th grade, you're continuing to see the same trends. Okay. If you look at Pennsylvania 4th graders, 26% of your kids are reading below basic overall, 48% of your low-income kids, 19% of Caucasian white kids, 52 black, not reported American Indian, and 52% Hispanic. I mean, this is ridiculous, particularly when the research shows that there doesn't have to be any more than about 8% that have a difficulty. 8th grade, same kind of trends. All right, so it's disappointing, obviously. What the heck have we been able to do with all of this? Well, I think there is some progress made. I always have to kind of think back on the progress medicine made in terms of moving from philosophical approaches to treatment and the use of weird therapies like leeches and blooding and so forth and so on. That took them 100 years, so we've got a little time, but I think we should have learned from medicine, so we cut that 100 years back pretty much, you know. But why is this? It doesn't have to be that way. So the title of the talk, I mean, we know a lot more than this shows. So what's going on? So we're not thinking through some of this. We hadn't figured something out, so I'll talk a little bit about that. But what we do know continues to be replicated, a scientific necessity, over and over and over again. So the stuff you hear from me today, if you've heard me talk before, is basically the same. New studies drill down into the major findings, and we know a lot more. For example, I'll be talking about the neurochemistry of learning and reading and so forth when we break out. That's how the drilling down occurs. But, you know, the basic trends, what we know, have stayed pretty much the same. We hadn't overturned any of it, have we, Hollis? No. So what do we have to work on here when we continue to see this and we have the information that would predict, in the best of all worlds, we wouldn't see that? Now, one of the things that Bob Sweet has always taught me about is that education is as much political as it is scientific. And it's a very, very tough competition that rides through this. Let me give you an example of how political influences keep us from really using what we know. These are NAEP scores. If you go to your Pennsylvania end-of-year state tests, the numbers you will see are much higher than these, much higher. So Pennsylvania might report that they have a 60% proficiency rate, or even higher. That's a state test. Why does the state test show that when the national tests don't? Well, to be sure, there are differences in how NAEP is administered and what NAEP is asking the kids to do. No doubt about that. But the fact of the matter is NAEP is what we call more ecologically valid. It's actually asking youngsters questions that are more related to what they need to know in school. It's stuff that kids really have to get the stuff in, the print in. They have to think about it. They have to think, reason, and so forth and so on. That's what the NAEP is looking at. Our state tests, I don't know. I vowed years ago, and my wife said she'd kill me if I ever was less than kind. But, you know, it could be that states just need to feel like they look good. I don't know why they would continue this kind of minimal measurement when so many kids are hurting. The NAEP is the better reflection, not perfect, but better reflection of how our kids are doing, not the state tests in any state. So you got to wonder about that, and if, you know, when we're talking with legislators as citizens, it's important for us to ask, why in the world do our state tests differ from what the national tests are showing? And doesn't that kind of keep people in the dark about where we really need help? You know? Where's the urgency if you're 60 to 70% proficient? So you all have heard me talk about these kinds of things. I'm a very concrete guy. I started out my research in 1976, basically. That's terrible. Asking these questions because I didn't know them. I actually was training in neurophysiology and neuropsychology, and I wanted to pick a skill, a cognitive skill that I thought was fairly complex, that I could better understand how the brain was supporting it. In other words, how does the brain learn to read? How do kids learn to read? And what goes into that? And why? Because it's complex. And I knew, trained in a Lyon, a guy named A.R. Luria. Well, I was trained in Lurian models, and we know that there are multiple and distributed systems in brain that all work together to allow us to do hard things. So I was trying to map the reading systems that were involved, brain systems, in learning how to read. And we didn't have imaging then. We had EEG and so forth and so on. But anyway, problem was I didn't know a lick about reading. I don't know why I even thought I could understand it, because I'd never been in the classroom. And I'd been studying monkeys up until then. I thought it was just the same kind of thing, you know. Train those kids up like I do the monkeys. So I got some good advice. Somebody said, hey, Reid, you're going to do this kind of work with children in schools. Don't you think you ought to know about what they're doing in the schools and what teachers have to do? I said, yeah, I guess so. He said, well, why don't you go teach? And I said, you got to be kidding me. You know, I don't know anything about that. So I went back and took a lot of education courses in both education and special education. Back then, the education courses, in contrast to now, were terrible. I didn't learn a thing. I'm just being facetious about in contrast to now. You know, in a lot of places. So I get into my first third grade classroom, and all of that wonderful information I learned in my classes, you know, did not prepare me for 8 and 9-year-olds who were off the wall, you know. About 30% of them couldn't read. I couldn't figure that out. You know, I'd ask another teacher, and they would say, well, it's their parents. That's why they can't read. And I'd ask another teacher, and they'd say, well, it's the second grade teacher, and that's why they can't read. Or it's the kid or whatever. And my joke has always been, and it's probably true, that 30% couldn't read when I went in, and by the time I finished the year, 40% couldn't read because I screwed another 10% up. But it was at that time that I finally understood the complexity, where the real complexity lives, and that's in the children actually trying to acquire this code when they don't get it easily. And these kids were from every walk of life, you know, they weren't just rich kids. This was actually an inner city school in Albuquerque, so I had a lot of second language kids and kids from lower economic strata, but some, you know, more middle class kids as well. And I saw the reading difficulties didn't respect socioeconomic lines. They're kids from, you know, more wealthy environments. Some of them had a little bit of a difficulty and so forth. So what I saw was my tremendous ignorance. What I saw was the complexity. What I saw was, in every research we need to do, we always have to keep an eye on what the importance of this is. The importance is what the children need to learn, and how can we help teachers support that learning, rather than just sticking my electrode in a single cell in the hippocampus or something. So, you know, that was an eye-opening experience. Since I blame my failure on pupil-teacher ratio, I had about 30 kids, rookie teacher, can you imagine? I went and taught a special education class the next year, which was a self-contained classroom. In Albuquerque, we call those D-level classrooms. So I had the same 11 kids all day long, and they were severely dyslexic, and I did them no good either. So this experience said, you know, Reid, you don't even know how reading develops. You don't even know what goes into it. You don't even know what these kids have to learn to be able to pull print off a page and relate it to what they know and to learn new things and be excited. You don't know that. You don't know the skills they need, the abilities they need to deploy. You don't know the genetic factors that go into it. You don't know anything about the neurobiology of these complex systems. You don't know anything about how home life and environments and that kind of stuff get in the way or support reading. You don't know anything. And so, you know, what are you doing? So, you know, being concrete, I just said, well, why don't I ask these questions? How do you learn to read? And why are a lot of these kids having difficulty? And, you know, since the kids in the third grade were already so, it seemed to me, emotionally devastated. You know, I'd ask them to read out loud. And that was a dumb thing to do, but they would really be fearful. I saw fear in their eyes. They were extremely hurt by their difficulties learning to read. And so, you know, how do you stop this before it ever starts? Seemed to me by 9 years of age, these kids had failed, obviously, 2.5 years counting kindergarten, and here they are again. And now, if you ask kids about their neighbors in the classroom, how do you tell who's smart in this classroom? A question I would ask in research, and they would say, well, he reads well. So reading kind of for little ones or kids is a proxy for how smart the kid is. So that's why a lot of kids feel stupid. You know, that's devastating. And it gets devastating and so forth as the kids get older. That's why the work you guys do is so important. So how do you stop this stuff? And then if you don't prevent it, how do we remediate it? So those were the 4 questions. Those came up in 1978. So, you know, the arrogance that I had, I said, I can probably answer all of these. Yeah, amazing. It's great to grow up. So I actually started on the first when I was doing a certain kind of research where I was trying to identify different types of kids with dyslexia under my idea was that if there were different types of dyslexia, that is, not all kids read poorly for the same reason, then there are probably differential instructional methodologies that would be more beneficial for the different types. Okay, so I thought I was going along well. You know, as a young professor at Northwestern University, you know, I was clicking along, I was publishing all this stuff, and I went to a conference, and there was a guy named Jack Fletcher there and Robin Morris, frickin' frack, for those who know him. These are great guys, have become my wonderful lifetime friends, but Jack Fletcher is not a shrinking violet, and he doesn't have any social skills. So I presented my stuff, and Jack said, Reid, you're full of shit. Okay. You know, you're off here and here and here. So I said, okay, I got to go think about that. But Jack was right. So what do you do when somebody's right? You go work with them. And so I've been working with Jack for 35 years, you know. So what have we learned? Well, it finally dawned on me that there was no way for us to figure this stuff out without a lot of brilliant minds, a lot of brilliant scientists, and so forth. So I was given the opportunity and the privilege to be recruited to the National Institutes of Health. And the NIH is and has been a stellar organization. It's getting more bureaucratic. But when I first got there, boy, we could turn on a dime scientifically. If we found something, we could go right to the direction it was pointing to us, and so forth and so on. But anyway, I was recruited because I had this neurobiology in my background as well as supposedly this education background and so forth. So my job was to develop a research program in learning disorders and in dyslexia and that kind of thing. So why don't I just build it around these 4 questions? So basically, that's what has been going on for some time. And how did we do the science? Well, this is an incomplete list. You know, it's a list of all of the sites around the country that have been doing this, answering these 4 questions for more than 35 years. Actually, the first site that came online was the Haskins Laboratories in Connecticut, under the direction of Alan Isabel Lieberman. And with them was a very young scholar, brilliant scholar by the name of Hollis Scarborough, who's right back there. And Hollis and Susan Brady and Ann and, you know, all of the folks that were there, Ken Pugh later on, they're all maniacs. I mean, you talk about getting medieval on people, but, you know, but they're great people and great scientists. So right in your midst is one of the first people to ever start to work on that, and that's Hollis back there. And she's taught us a bunch about how you identify kids early, and we may not know as much as we think we know, you know, which is always trouble when you think you know something, and then she comes along and says, bullshit, excuse me. But anyway, all of these sites, you can just look around. You see Hollis's name there under Rutgers, where, you know, but she was actually up in Connecticut with the Haskins Labs, Ann Fowler and the Liebermans and Carol Fowler and so forth. And the Shaywitz group at Yale, Barbara Foreman and Louisa Moats were doing the first randomized trial ever to understand which reading approaches had the best effect on reading difficulties. Frank Wood was done, but anyway, you guys can read all that. You'll see names popping up. And anyway, so there's a lot more sites now. When I was leaving, and a couple of years before I left NIH, I was down in Texas. There was this guy called me in my office at NIH one day, and he said, I picked up the phone, he said, "Hi, this is George Bush. I work as a governor down here in Texas." He said, I got all these kids can't read. I'm not doing his voice very well, but, you know, if I could see his hands, he'd go, I appreciate if you could come down. Everybody's telling me different reasons why these kids can't read, and I don't know who to trust, and I hear you guys got some science. Would you come down here and explain it to me? So whatever you think of George Bush, I mean, he was way ahead of everybody else in terms of being worried about this literacy stuff. So I went down there and worked with his people and so forth and so on. And he said, when I was going out the door, first or second time, he said, "Hey, Reid, you know, I got a lot of kids down here who don't speak English at all. Their first language is Spanish. Can you do anything for those? Why don't you go back up there and figure that out?" So I called Bob Sweet. I said, "Bob, how can we get some legislative help on it?" But long story short, we actually began what is now the largest program to understand how kids who speak Spanish as a first language learn to read and write and listen and speak in English. And I recruited a lady by the name of Peggy McCardle to my branch in the NIH, and she ran that, and then she became a great branch chief. Anyway, so this map is now cluttered even more. There are sites all over the place, all asking for questions. So what the heck, you know, who's really contributed to all that? Well, when this slide was built, you know, there were 57,000 studies that had been done, you know, looking at 22,000 good readers, 35,000 at-risk or struggling readers. The average number of years one kid was studied was 9. These were 5-year longitudinal studies, but typically they moved on beyond that. There's 12 randomized trials in terms of trying to figure out what works. A lot of schools, a lot of teachers, and so forth. And I had gotten it up to $60 million a year. I guess Bob would always help me with that, or a little bit more. But anyway, so the stuff I'm talking to you, all this is just a lot of noise from me talking to you about what I present now. And what I present now has come from all those beautiful, wonderful, talented scientists. And in a way, the data were collected in a very rigorous, thoughtful, objective way. So what you're going to hear me talk about now has been replicated many, many times. So there's nothing I'm going to say right now that's going to be, you know, nonsense. A lot of the stuff I'll say has to be taken in the scientific kind of way of it can change. You know, everything changes the more information we get. But this is pretty well solid information. And basically they said, you know, Reid, you know, when they asked me in Congress, they asked me to question what do kids need to know, and that's what I said. But there's even this is the complex way I said it. Okay. So there's a difficulty in reading words accurately and speedily, fluently. There's insufficient vocabulary, general knowledge, and reasoning skills to support comprehension and written language. And over time, there's going to be a loss or absence of the kids' motivation to keep going, which is all expected. So I'm not telling you anything new, right? I mean, but if you want to get your hands around something, those are the big buckets. The smaller buckets are a little bit more detailed, and what I'll show you now is not detailed enough. But, all right, in order for us to, you know, understand what we're reading, the middle thing, which is the critical issue in reading, you've got to be able to get that print off the page in an accurate and speedy way. You can't be futzing around with, you know, sounding out everything and barking at the print, because you'll forget what the heck you read. Now, how many of us in this room have kids, as kids, our parents and teachers who have watched kids, you know, just struggle? Their fluency is down. How many of us have seen that? Yeah, about 100%. Okay, so here you go. You got someone who is not automatic in trying to pull print off a page, and guess what? It takes so long they won't remember what they read, and it takes so long they're going to lose motivation, and they're going to feel stupid if you ask them to do it out loud. But how do you become fluent? I mean, what are the micro variables that allow us to be fluent? What does it take to be fluent? Well, if you look at kind of smaller skill buckets, you know, what you'll see down at the bottom is this stuff called phonemic awareness, right? Everybody knows about phonemic awareness. By the way, that discovery was found at Haskins Laboratories. That's who really began to explain phonemic awareness. It's a weird kind of thing. It's a serendipitous finding, meaning they were looking at something else and they came across this. But the issue with phonemic awareness, people say, well, what's the big deal? All you got to do is know that sounds are in the language. But we never hear the sounds in the language. You know, when you're listening to me speak, you don't hear any sounds. You know, you hear my language coming across. If you were hearing my sounds, as I said, I would be talking like this, right? It would take too long. So I'm not sounding out when I'm talking with you all. I am saying words, and hidden within those words or syllables or whatever are these teeny sounds we call phonemes. And I'm simplifying this a lot. And, you know, how do kids get these phonemes, you know? Well, you know, the early reading we all do with our kids from birth onward and so forth, typically the readings are readings that have a lot of rhyming to them, a lot of silliness. You ever notice that? You know, Dr. Seuss and so forth. Well, just by exposing the brain to this lilting up and down kind of prosody and the changing of word pronunciations with one sound, what we call reading, begins to specialize cells in the human brain. It begins to actually enable particular cells to metaphorically tug acoustic signals apart, so that a lot of kids at 4 and 5, or Hollis will tell us how earlier than that, are actually able to rhyme when they're little. Okay, so stay with me here. Here, the kid is expected in our language, our alphabetic language, 26 letters, how many ever phonemes, everybody's yelling about that, but if I said 44, would that be okay? Yeah, whatever. So the job is to put, you know, for the beginning reader, the sounds on top of the letters, right? That's what they do. But how do you put sounds on top of letters if you don't know where the sounds are? So when people say, what's this phonemic awareness? You say, that's grist for the mill. That's the sound structure that has to go on top of the letters to unlock new words or unfamiliar words. But you never hear the sound, so what's going on? Well, kids that do not have a genetic predisposition toward difficulties in this area, and or kids who are read to a great deal, and they play with language, and they do rhyming games, and they do ubby-dubby from birth onward, their brains tend to specialize those cells fairly well. And so that's, you know, why a lot of kids can come to preschool, kindergarten, and first grade, and they seem to have acquired this reading capability effortlessly and without any instruction. But if you go to their homes and you see what their parents are doing, there's a lot of instruction going on, but that's another story. Okay. So what the Haskins folks helped us understand was that the words you hear are composed of smaller sounds that the ear never hears. So if I ask people how many sounds are in the word cat, people, particularly teachers or parents who have been involved with Barbara's program, will say 3, cat. But the ear never hears cat. The ear only hears one acoustic bundle, and the brain then tugs those sounds apart. You with me? That's why it's hard for a lot of kids who either, number one, weren't exposed to the language, didn't play with the language early on, or genetically have certain kinds of messaging systems which didn't move cells of a particular capacity into a particular brain system. Okay? So genetic codes are involved. We know there's several chromosomes involved. It's very complex. Elena Grigorenko does a lot of that good work now. But so that's that early stuff, that phoneme stuff. It's not easy. It's not easy for me to explain it. It's not easy for you all to explain it. But when you hear a lot about phonemic awareness, what we know is it's exceedingly important. But we also need to know it's a small piece of reading. If you just teach phonemic awareness, phonics, for a lot of kids who struggle, will not come along automatically. And phonics is absolutely critical because what you are doing is unlocking new words. Now, you can't, when you come across a word with proficiency, guess what that word is. There's been a lot of theoretical and ideological emphasis on you don't need to use these decoding skills because they are, you know, they'll bore people and, you know, they'll make them into Rush Limbaugh or whatever. So, you know, what happens is, okay, kids were learning to read the surrounding context, what we call the sentence structure, the syntax, and the vocabulary, the semantics. The teachers in here will know what I'm talking about. And let's say you're coming across a word that you don't know. You go back and look at the language around it in print, and then you predict that word, its pronunciation. That's a great idea if it worked that way, but it doesn't work that way because only about 1 in 8 words can be predicted from surrounding context. So, you know, it's not going to be very efficient. So why would you do that? If you ask kids to do it, great, but don't rely on it as the first line of instruction. You know, if you like it, fine. If the kids like it, if there's 1 of the 8 words that can be guessed at, okay. But it's not, what I'm saying is you've got to use the F stuff, the F word. You got to use phonics. You know, it's absolutely essential, non-negotiable. You know, Bob and I used to be called the Phonicator Boys. I actually thought that was a compliment, but then I knew they were talking about reading or something. Okay, but we, you know, as usual, we'll shoot ourselves in the foot. So we go, okay, we got to have this phonemic awareness and this phonics. You got to teach phonics. You got to have phonics. If kids aren't taught phonics, they're not going to leave very long. Phonics, phonics. Phonics is absolutely critical, non-negotiable, essential, but it in no way is it sufficient to get to the middle circle, right? Language, as the Haskins folks used to say in a brilliant phrase, I don't know if this was Isabel Liberman or Al or whatever, but reading is parasitic on language. Reading is not natural. Oral language seems to have genetic direction when we come on the planet. You know, how do you know that? Well, kids' language emergence kind of looks the same across cultures. Kids coo and babble and use single word, holophrastic speech, and then they use pivot open grammar and stuff. But anyway, they come along in a sequence, whether you're from Russia or US or whatever, suggesting that there is a code that moves language in predictable developmental sequences. Reading is very young from an evolutionary perspective. It doesn't have, you know, a genetic code to put it in place. The genes of reading, when we talk about the genetic aspects of reading, we're talking about the genetics of particular linguistic capabilities, like phonemic awareness. The genetics for reading, there's, you know, it's not a natural kind of thing. It's not an endowed trait. We have to learn it. And we can't learn it if we don't have particular language capabilities, including the phonemic stuff, but many others. Making sense? Okay. So that's what you see up here. Oral language skills, knowledge of language structures, vocabulary, written expression, cultural influences. The language that surrounds all of these concepts are absolutely essential for learning to pull print off the page, block 1, Learning to do that speedily, block 1. Beginning to relate it to what you already know, block 2. The ability to read something which resonates with you. Well, nothing resonates if you don't understand word meanings. You know, I could read astrophysics all day long, and I could do it rapidly and automatically. I don't think I could come away from that with a very in-depth understanding. So now we move to something absolutely essential, non-negotiable, can't read without it. Is that still enough? No. Knowledge. You know, at Woodland School, they pride themselves on teaching reading in the content areas. So they're always developing language. And they're always developing a language that's relevant to what the kids want to do. So you not only develop vocabulary that's related to general life, but you develop vocabulary that's related to domains, domain-specific knowledge, and so forth. Standing in front of me to my right is Cynthia Coletti-Hahn. Now, she and I go back many, many years because of her courage as a mother of 2 dyslexic kids. But Cynthia is the main mover now of how we can help parents and teachers and educators at the college level begin to understand what all of this is talking about in common sense terms. Cindy has I'll show you a little bit more about it, but has a very cross-international kind of group called Literate Foundation. But anyway, there's got to be a way to explain what I'm trying to say here. So I'm doing it orally, but you guys, if you hadn't heard it before, may have a hard time remembering it. So I'm just saying there's a lot of effort going out to talk about these kinds of things. So what I'm saying, like when I was talking about Woodland School, is you can even have the vocabulary when you're reading, but you got to have background knowledge. I remember some studies that NIH was doing over in England, and one of the studies was looking at what we call background knowledge, and they asked a bunch of Brits whether they knew what this sentence meant. Jones sacrificed and knocked in a run. Well, a lot of them didn't know that because that's baseball. They're used to cricket. But they knew each of the meanings of each of the individual words. But did they really know what I was saying? No. You with me? Background knowledge. So you've got to have vocabulary, but then you also have to have background knowledge. Still not enough. Particularly with kids who struggle in learning how to read, we have to make sure that we address motivation. We have to make sure that we are moving them along in ways where they get something out of it. They have to get something out of it. I'll keep you awake. They have to feel smart. You know? You remember that program called Drop Everything and Read, Silent Sustained Reading? Well, I mean, Bob Sweet always had the question about that, and when the National Reading Panel came along, that was one of the questions. Does silent sustained reading improve reading comprehension or any other reading behavior? And it came out it did not. The studies were showing it did not. Does that mean that sitting down with books and reading them don't improve reading? No. This is where you have to drill down. What goes along with silent sustained reading, why it's not effective or was not then, was that when kids were given the choice of books to, you and me, I almost did the same thing up here, don't worry about it. When kids are given the choice of which books to choose, kids struggling will, guess what, pick higher level books. And kids who are very good blow it off and pick simple stuff. They don't challenge themselves. Now, these are broad swath generalizations, but that's basically the data. If you do not read at an instructional level where that you're bringing stuff in at a rate of fluency and accuracy and so forth, you're not going to become a better reader by reading on your own. So it was a monitoring variable that got in the way. Anytime you ask kids to sit down and read on their own, it's just important to make sure that they can get the information in and they can deal with it. But in silent sustained reading wasn't the case. It really was a surprising kind of thing. But it isn't surprising. Kids who don't do something well are definitely going to not want to show that. So, okay, all that's the general stuff. Now, here's what's involved, and here's why IDA at the national level under Emerson's leadership and at the local level under Julia's leadership and so forth. This is what people can't get their hands around. Okay, we know all of this. We know that kids need sound structure. They need to be able to attach sounds to letter formations and so forth. We know they have to do that rapidly and accurately. We know that as they're bringing information off a page of print or off of a Kindle or whatever, they have to understand word meanings. They can infer word meanings to some degree, but they have to understand most of the words. They have to also relate what they're reading to what they know, their background knowledge. That's part of the motivational issue. You give kids books, particularly kids from different cultures, books about other cultures, there's not going to be as much buy-in initially as if we have background knowledge comparison. And we've got to teach kids how to comprehend, how to ask themselves questions, how to stay ahead of the story, how to predict as they're reading. You know, just think about it. If we all read kind of fiction things that gets exciting, aren't we predicting what might happen again up front? Well, a lot of kids don't do that at all. They don't know to do that. As we're reading, we summarize as we go along. We don't know it, but that's what we do. Well, kids sometimes don't understand they're supposed to do that. As we're reading, we say, we relate it to our own life. You know, that's where it gets pretty cool, and we can read something related to our... A lot of kids don't know that they should ask that question. Is this something I've done before, or kind of so forth and so on. All right, so we know all that. We don't know everything. Probably we know 20%, but what we do know, certainly, if we use it right, helps an awful lot of kids. But here's where it gets rough. If we're just talking about kids in those graphs upward at the 50% below basic, kids from low-income families, as I mentioned, typically they have much less exposure to print. Families don't read as much to kids as families of upper income or middle income. They have about 50% of the vocabulary of kids from higher level socioeconomic strata. And their ranges of experiences and conceptual knowledge is not as robust. You know, we take kids to the zoo, we take kids to the park, we take kids to the library. We're always talking to kids, you know. You watch young parents as babies are born, you know. They're reading Chaucer to the kid or Shakespeare. You know? Kid can't even hold their head up. You know, I know parents that pumped in music, you know, blasted out Mozart. You know, if it makes you feel good, go for it. Not too many kids are going to learn from it, but you know what I'm saying. And a lot of people don't read in the home, so here's what we're looking at. In the first and second grade, kids need to learn about 800 words per year, 2 a day. If you're coming in 50% behind, okay, do the math. When we get up to about the 3rd grade, then 2,000 to 3,000 words per year, about 6 to 8 per day. If they're half behind, do the math. And typically, you know, learning a word is typically a repetitious process that pushes what we call long-term potentiation in brain, which gives us the plasticity to learn new things and so forth. So you got to do it that way. So that's what we're looking at. We got kids who are just skimming along in terms of accuracy and speed. Are they comprehending? Not if they don't have the vocabulary. So we are looking at youngsters, and then kids who do come from rich environments, rich in literacy, I mean rich literate environments. Typically those are from, economic strata that can afford books. Doesn't have to be rich people, you know what I mean? But environments where parents are reading to their kids, playing language games, dinner table conversation, and all that kind of stuff. A lot of these words are bandied about all the time. People say, you mean to tell me you got to learn 6 to 8 words a day? Well, we do that all the time. I mean, kids do that all the time. Just watch them. So that's no big, genius kind of thing. Most kids do learn that much. So do you just pound in this vocabulary 12 times? No. That's why when we're teaching, the vocabulary we're using in language arts is the same vocabulary, or some of it that we also use in social studies is the same vocabulary we also use in math, and so forth and so on. Well, that requires coordination across teachers, doesn't it? So sometimes that doesn't happen. So we have domain-specific vocabulary or general vocabulary, but it needs to really be contextualized, and we have to work together to do that. Okay, so if we want to get to that middle circle, what are we looking at? A kid has to be able to read about 95% of the words accurately in text to comprehend what is read. To comprehend, a student must know the meanings of 90 to 95% of the words being read. They can begin to infer new meanings. All right, you see it? You want to get serious? All right. Those are good benchmarks because they predict pretty well. It's, when people are kind of futzing around the edges with this kind of thing, and we have to start somewhere, and we've been doing a good job. Evidence-based instruction requires that we identify what we're teaching and we monitor its progress as a function of the teaching and so forth. But sometimes we get very excited, and we should, about a nice linear growth in word reading skills or comprehension or something. But that's where you have to get to. So now the question is, under what conditions instructionally can I make sure that the youngsters that I am with, teaching and so forth, are able to inculcate that level of expertise? Okay? Right there in front of us. That's why it's hard. That's why we work so hard and so hard and so hard, and we don't sometimes see the results or the fruits of our labor. So, these are good proficient readers. We can get through life with less, but people aren't going to like to read typically. They won't pick up a book on their own. You ask people, do they like to read? And they say, oh, I hate it. A lot of people, just ask adults. A lot of them say, I know, I hate to read. And so I say, well, why is that? And they say, well, it's kind of a chore for me. It doesn't come automatic. A lot of you in this room don't even think about when you're reading what's going on. If you ever come across a word you don't know, guess what you use? Phonics. The F word. I said yesterday, I was talking to people, I said, okay, let me put this word in a sentence, oligodendroglioma. All right, you come across that word, you can't predict it from the surrounding context. How are you going to pronounce it? You're going to use phonemic awareness and phonics to unlock that word, oligodendroglioma. Anyway, so we use it for the rest of our life. But you may not know what it means, therefore it's not going to be interesting, therefore you won't mess with it, and so forth and so on. All right. Hollis's work, Don Hirsch has always related Hollis's work to his own. That just shows you that little gaps between oral language and reading down at the 4th and 5th year levels turn into major gaps by the time it gets to 11 or 12. Pay now or pay later, right? That's what happens. So, a lot of the things in our career or our professional life have, we've had to struggle with a lot of differing ideas. So if that gap occurred early on and parents may have been looking at, well, my kid in reading he doesn't seem to enjoy it. He's struggling with the words and so forth. That parent may be told, well, don't worry about it. Everything will develop in time. He's a boy. He's got a developmental lag. Well, if you adhere to that particular idea, that's what happens. Reading difficulties aren't a developmental lag. When reading difficulties occur, or precursors, or signs that the reading difficulty might occur, you get right to it. You don't mess around. You mess around, that's what happens. So state accountability measures typically place high demands on vocabulary, but not as high as the NAEP does. And these demands accelerate after elementary school. You ever heard the 4th grade slump? Kids do pretty good on reading tests up until the 4th grade and then downhill. Why is that? Well, now the tests at the 4th grade, whether they're state tests, which are much simpler than the NAEP, or the NAEP test, now they're asking kids to use those skills for a higher purpose. So if we haven't melded together very robust and rigorous instruction and vocabulary and comprehension and so forth, then we're going to see kids doing well. Get through the 3rd grade, 4th grade, state tests, NAEP measures, boom. It's a big surprise to people. It shouldn't be a surprise because we've focused too much on word level skills without. We want to focus on them all day long, but we focused on them without always building oral language and vocabulary. People say, how you do that? Barbara Wilson and I have had this discussion many times, that anytime you're teaching a particular vowel pattern, or anytime you're teaching any reading concept at the phonological level or at the the CVC level and so forth, always use that as an opportunity to spark off vocabulary. What other words start with that initial consonant? What does that word mean? What's the opposite of that word? How else are you going to close a gap where the kids are coming to us 50% behind in some cases? So every opportunity has to be given over to not only teaching very specifically, very directly, word-level skills, but using those as platforms to embellish vocabulary every chance you get. Again, these are just the demands that kids come from your classrooms and that they will meet when they go do their end-of-year tests. Okay. So people ask me about this all the time. Is there one program that is equally beneficial for all kids? No, we've never been able to find that in randomized trials, meaning that some kids respond and some kids do not. Now, what does that mean? That places the onus on teachers. And it says to the teachers, okay, I'm implementing this particular program and I'm really doing it with fidelity, and I still have youngsters who aren't responding the way I want to. Well, the question is, where is the breakdown? What are my assessment data telling me about which of the components of reading are lagging a little bit behind? It could be the kid has great word level skills, but vocabulary is lagging, so comprehension is down. And since vocabulary affects fluency, fluency is down. So teachers have to ask those questions. Okay, what does it take to learn to read? It takes okay, what might be going wrong? Could be on the phonemic stuff, could be up at the semantic or vocabulary level, could be the youngster doesn't know the job yet. They don't know what they're supposed to be asking as they're reading, So that's why it's absolutely essential to do progress monitoring so you can make those minute adjustments. But there's just no one program that'll do it. It always does come back to the teacher, unfortunately, and people have tried to make things teacher-proof, and you ain't ever going to do it. I mean, how many of you have been through the Wilson training? That's pretty rigorous, ain't it? Yeah. So that's what she's teaching you, how to do all of these kind of minute adjustments as you go along, how to represent the information, you know. It's a pretty neat thing, but it's rigorous. And people say, well, teachers don't want to do that, or they don't have time. Well, yeah, they do. They have a lot of time. I'm kidding. But we do know this, you know, people say, well, give me some general kind of things. Well, the instruction has to be systematic and explicit. You can't ask kids to be guessing. You can't ask kids to kind of wander around, waste time trying to think of what does this person want from me? What am I trying to learn? Why am I trying to learn it? What does it mean to me? What does it mean to my life? Intensity. Unfortunately, a half hour a day for many kids aren't going to do it. For some kids, a 90-minute reading block plus 45 minutes is not going to do it. Remember, you've got to close a lot of gaps. Now, the brains have to deploy on this one. If you've got a youngster who needs a 90-minute reading block and an hour and a half individualized block or small group block on top of that, you know, how are you going to keep the kid interested? What do we have to give up? What is the philosophy of the leadership? Is having a wide range of academic subjects or specials the important thing, or is reading the most fundamental thing? These are all leadership issues and teacher issues. This is just vocabulary, what goes into good vocabulary. This is Isabel Beck's work from Pittsburgh. It just means you don't just teach one thing about vocabulary. You have to represent vocabulary. If Marianne Wolf was here, I'd kiss her because she does great at developing vocabulary. If you've ever go online, look up RAVO, R-A-V-E-O. Marianne's done great work in that area in terms of teaching vocabulary, making it interesting. It's really good. So, what do you have to do to comprehend? Let's just review. You got to have accurate and fluent reading skills. You got to have good vocabulary. You got to be able to understand what the heck you're reading. You got to have good conceptual and factual knowledge. That gives you background. You got to be able to ask yourself questions as you read. You got to reason through things and predict and draw inferences. If A happens, what will happen with B, and so forth. And if you do this, then you might enjoy it and you get some motivation to go about it. But we have to program or design instruction so it's inherently interesting. Makes kids smile. You know, it'd be nice if it was this easy to teach reading. You know, we just put a swash of color across something, and there they go. So, back to the simple stuff. Comprehension depends on how well you read the words, how much knowledge you have, how you think, and how motivated you are to do the work of comprehension. We've talked about, again, this is Hollis's work up top, sensitive and valid screening measures. Hollis has worked on letter sounds, letter names, vocabulary. What kinds of vocabulary should be there to predict how well the kid will do downstream? Professional development. I know we are all frustrated with current teacher preparation practices, and that's a whole other kind of discussion. That will only change as the light is shown on how important reading is and how complex it is. And given its complexity, what our teachers have to know. It's simple. You're not going to be an architect if you do not understand a particular set of fundamental skills. You're not going to comprehend what you read without a particular set of fundamental skills. You're not going to be able to teach teachers about that unless you are a master of that information. And that's the simple common sense of it. You know, just a little story. Bob Sweet and I Bob Sweet was on the Education Committee, House Education and Workforce Committee in Congress when I was at NIH. And Bob was the champion of most of the initiatives that have focused on literacy, if you don't know that. He is the one that actually, when people called me at NIH, that was him doing that. That's the guy that did it because of his love for kids, of his clear recognition that if we do not teach kids to read, they will not make it in life. He also taught me how to do a lot of shenanigans behind the scenes. So a lot of people don't know this, but I mean, the whole, education, the Institute for Education Research, or Sciences, IES, that was conceptualized with Bob and John Boehner, I don't even want to say his name or whatever, and Mike Castle, and myself, back in I think it was in the Clinton days, that started to be worked through. And the language that went into it, we had already done that. That's him. Reading First, that's his brainchild, right there. Right. And boy, did we have to do all kind of weird things in Reading First. The National Reading Panel, ever heard about that? That only came about because of we saw something moving back door. I mean, we saw there was a report called Beginning Reading, the Beginning Reading Report. Anyway, it was supposed to look at all of the reading instruction in the world and say what worked, but they weren't using really good data screens and so forth. So we went and talked to congressional members. I can say this now, right? And they said, go ahead and write the legislation. So we wrote the legislation for reading, for the National Reading Panel. That's how that came about. And why did it come about? Because this gentleman over there. And that's, it's amazing. So that's all kind of abstract crap. But if you ever wonder how reading got to be the forefront, of the education world from a funding Washington point of view, I'm just telling you how all that works. And I was totally naive. So these are the kinds of things that Hollis has discovered and talked to us about. The risk characteristics in kindergarten, grade 1. So, here's the issue. We've got to be able to use all of the science that we have in developing strong instructional routines and developing assessment systems that give us constant, immediate feedback about how well the kids are doing. We've got to have great teachers to be able to capitalize on that assessment information. But it's not enough. We talk about necessary and not sufficient. That's going to leave us just out there in the ozone. We have to have leaders and organizational structures and classroom practices that allow everything that we have learned to be put in place. Let me come to you. Let's say you're a superintendent of this district. We've got a lot of kids reading below the basic level. Hopefully that person will say, why is that? And we'll say, well, a lot of these kids come from homes where there wasn't a lot of resources, so they're pretty far behind in fundamental reading skills, and that's going to take instruction that has to be of this caliber, has to be of this duration, has to be of this intensity. So then it's, the leader has to be able to say, well, that's what we will do, right? And so we never talk about anymore everything that we should be doing that we know. One of the major reasons that we are not using what we know and putting it into service is because leadership and organizations haven't caught up with that. And also, education is politicized. So we're not somehow connecting. I always used to think if I could persuade the congressional committees with language, I would talk about reading being not an educational problem as much as a public health problem. Well, there's people in this room that are very good at that, and I'll show you that in a minute. Well, everything, you know. But these are problems to be solved. They're people, human problems. And how does one persuade decision makers to actually commit intelligent thinking to it, to actually look at the evidence, to actually consider different ways of going about things? You know, unfortunately, all of this would have never happened, really, all of this research from way back, without parents. It was parents that drove a lot of these organizations, you know. LDA, you know, Learning Disabilities Association, that was started by parents in Chicago, 1968. So parents have a lot to do with this because they represent unbiased, they're biased because their kids are struggling, but they represent unbiased kinds of feelings, you know. Everybody else, the legislators, will think they have some kind of agenda, but that's a whole other discussion. But this is what I was saying initially. We have not yet figured out how to make the gap between what we know and what we do compelling enough so that we override educational malpractice. We haven't done it yet. You know, I was talking to Cindy Hahn. What in the world is going on culturally? What goes on? Why the pushback? Why the resistance? Why? You know, it does come a lot through the higher education situation we have now, but we have to give a great deal of thought to that. So we do a lot of this work. I started out in this area, I'm back to this area, and so forth and so on. This just shows you some of the complexity. You know, when we were working early on, we knew that reading was complex. It wasn't just in one place in the brain. The little colored splotches there show some of the systems involved in reading that all have to integrate and work together. Some of them handle sound, some of them handle the shapes of letters, some of them do both, and it's complicated. And we don't know really a lot. By the way, when we look at these scans that I'll show you, what we're looking at are some pretty rudimentary pieces of data. We've got to drill down much more on that, which I'll talk about in the other session. But this is some of the work we were doing at the Center for Brain Health, where we're looking at TBI, traumatic brain injury, so we have to isolate the telephone wires that connect cells. This is called white matter, even though it's colored up here. But there's a lot in reading that has to do with how sound structures are realized that have to then be transmitted to other systems that handle different kinds of information, and it does it by those telephone wires. So that gives you a pretty good look at, you know, all the wires that are involved. See, that's what makes it kind of interesting, doesn't it? Here's another shot of it. And this one, you know, longitudinal fasciculus, you know. Now, one of our NIH groups out in Washington, Pat Cool, who's this really cool person. And, you know, what she was always interested in is how early can these little kids tell the differences between sounds and what's going on in the brain when they do it. So this little kid's having fun. They're looking at a screen. We call this a head-turn paradigm. So the little kid's, you know, just sitting there and something exciting comes on the screen. So in this case, there's a bear with symbols and makes a lot of noise and there's a lot of color. And the kid's riveted to the screen. Then we turn the TV off. Okay, then Pat pumps sound here and a sound here and records on the brain as she's doing that. But the sound here is very different from the sound here, you know. But it's only when the kid looks at the TV when those sounds are different that the bear comes up. And after a while, it doesn't take long at all, you know, the kid associates differences in sounds with the bear. So then you can gradually narrow those sounds down, the contrast down. So we know when the kid looks at the TV, they're hearing the difference. You with me? And so she's able to get to a pretty good point where she knows what kind of acoustic gymnastics this little brain is going through. And you can see, as the recordings are taking place, that we're starting to see the development of the neural foundation for tugging those sounds apart. Okay? And after a while, that signature will get a little bit more robust up there on the left, and after a while, it'll go back down to some degree because the efficiency is really developed. So, you know, a lot of the work in reading has been done using a number of modalities, imaging modalities. Here you're just looking on top of someone, but that's some of the reading system involved. And the colors just indicate how the cells are using, in this case, oxygen and sugar, glucose. There's other techniques we use to show how the cells are working. So whenever you see colors, it's just showing where the brain is working pretty hard. You know, if you want to do something and a part of your brain is responsible for it, well, it's going to need some nutrition, and it's going to need glucose, and it's going to need oxygen. So if you track those fundamentals through the brain, you can kind of get an idea of what's working. This is out of Tim Odegaard's lab, I believe. This is out of Tim's lab. And Tim has done great work. Tim heads up Barbara Wilson's research program now. Very elegant scholar that she was able to recruit. And then she's had to beat him around the ears a little bit so he gets out of the academic tower, you know, and understands what one has to do in classrooms. But anyway, Tim maps and converges evidence on what everybody else has, that a reading system is fairly well distributed, and it's distributed in those areas. Okay, that's replicated time after time after time. Also replicated is the fact that a dyslexic brain tends to look very different from that. You'll notice the left posterior, the blue dot, is not represented there. And that's typical of dyslexic readers and kids who come to us from disadvantage. Same kind of signature. Dyslexic readers, again, have more of a genetic push. That's why with dyslexic readers, if the youngster is having trouble, you know, the kid will come home and you say, well, let's go read to me. And the kid says, I hate to read. You know, just doesn't want to read. And you read. And so the kid gives you the book and you read the story, and then you guys talk about it all day long. The kid understands the concepts. The kid really has the vocabulary and so forth and so on. Well, what we've just done there is bypass the data in stage, the phonological and, you know, alphabetic principle stage. And so you're seeing someone, if the information in print was given in another way, there would be comprehension. With kids from disadvantage, since they don't typically have the vocabulary they need, then that's not going to be that helpful. And that's a double whammy with kids. Okay, John Gabrielli doing good work here. Typically reading kids, you see the same signature there, where the circles are on the left. You see the activation there. Okay, you see kids with dyslexia before reading remediation. You see very shallow kind of activation. Can you see it? And then after remediation, you see a return to robustness. Now, you're not going to see that in every kid. You know, severe dyslexia is a tough one to overcome. These slides are, again, a little just replicating on top of the ones I just showed you. So that's why I always say teachers are great brain surgeons. Now, you never stop at this level. I mean, these are all exciting. These signatures can be seductive. You know, they can tell us we think we know more than we do. Well, the activation in there that we are asking the computer to code in color is a function of proteins and a function of what we call neuroplasticity, which is neurochemically driven. So, you know, we have to really understand that level before we really understand this. But this is okay for now. But we're understanding how, for example, kids learn to associate letters and sounds and the neurochemistry involved in that. Because that's what the genetics are pushing. They're not pushing, at this global level. The genetics are pushing proteins to line up in a certain way to give a message to the brain to develop something here and here and here. That's the way it's done. So it's at a molecular level, and I'm putting everybody to sleep. But if we ever want to understand this stuff, there's got to be that work. So you can see normal reader up top, good, healthy signature in those areas on the right. Right hemisphere not activated to a great extent. The opposite in the dyslexic reader, but these are actually kids from disadvantage. These aren't dyslexic kids. And here are the remediation scans before and after. So now we're just looking at the kids with problems, and you can see that we're moving to a good, robust signature, and of course that's correlated with significant improvements in reading. Okay, can you keep it all straight? You see up top on the left, before intervention, come down below. You see the left hemisphere now activated. You also see a reduction on the bottom left over there in right hemisphere activation. Same with the kid on the right. So many, many labs have done these studies. There's tremendous replication. So yeah, this reading, whether it's dyslexia or not, occurs in the brain. And lousy reading shows us a different activation signature. In dyslexia, the activation signature appears to be coded in development through protein synthesis of the genetic code that does not put some receptors where we want them to go. So, what is going on with, we know all of this stuff, isn't it nice? We know all of this stuff, but how come we can't put it in? Implementation. Now, your school at Woodland can implement because you have the ability to do a lot of things that implementation requires. You can recruit teachers of a certain knowledge base, right? You can structure classrooms in ways that reinforce intensive instruction. You can have motivational activities woven into everything. Okay, so you're not normal.
I've been told that.
Yeah. In the real world, all of this has to take place before we even ever try to move a program. Even when I was a teacher in public schools, the short time I was there, they'd always be telling us to do this new program or that new program. They never asked the teachers, do they want to do a new program? They never taught us about what the program was before we started the new program. I mean, just common sense kind of went out the window. But you have to do that. We have to, in our profession, have a common language. One thing that you'll notice that you all have that most teachers don't. So, for example, if you and I are talking about a kid having difficulty, what's your name? Sally. And Sally may say, okay, I'm trying to teach Billy, and he's still struggling. He just doesn't seem like he wants to read. And so I can ask Sally, well, how's the phonemic awareness? And she'll say, yeah, I looked at it, and it's looking pretty good. And she might say, it could be just the fluency is down, and what do you think? Or it could be that, he's getting the print off the page, but the interest, the comprehension's off. And so we talk about vocabulary. See what I mean by a common language? You have to have that in any profession. If you don't have a common language, how in the world are you going to talk about a youngster and their difficulties and instruction? You can't do it. That's what the science provides us. But these are all precursors to getting something that works into place and sustained. Sustained is an operative word here. These are things that are absolutely non-negotiable. I mean, these are just big buckets. But I've worked with so many districts, and so has Barbara, that have no idea what we're even talking about. Now, Barbara has a collaboration with the National Implementation Research Network in Chapel Hill, UNC Chapel Hill. And they're probably, they've done the best work about how you take these very complex kinds of change patterns and put them in place. They've done it in medicine, they've done it in military, they've done it in education. So they move across disciplines, but the factors are all the same. But anyway, I know this sounds like it's far afield from helping kids learn to read, but you're not going to help kids learn to read unless we get in place and sustain the things that will work. And there are a set of conditions that are equally important as the conditions under which kids learn to read. This just gets a little bit more out in the abstract, and we say, well, that's not my job, and so forth, and it's not. But that's got to be paid attention to. All right. Everything has been coming to you just out of my mouth, quack, 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 you know. What's this guy saying? I don't remember anything. So here is where Cynthia Hahn's Literate Nation has begun to fill this void. And the website here, and the only reason I'm putting it up there, they don't make any money off of this thing. This is a national service of people from all over the country, and some international people contribute to, so that you get information about specific learning disabilities, English language learners, economically disadvantaged kids, blah, blah, blah. And so it drills down into it. It's just not, you know, okay, here's a comic book I can read and see some data. You know, there's a tremendous amount of information about what you do. What are the factors we have to consider if we want to put this particular program in? What do the teachers need to know? What do the administrators need to know? And so forth and so on. It's that detailed. And it's the first time this has ever been pulled together. We've done the National Reading Panel and all that kind of thing. But no one has ever had a resource where people can actually see what exactly is required, both on the practice side and on the legislative side as well. So, you know, this is something that is great for me to show after I talk, because I'm just skimming such a surface here. So legislation is covered. And anyway, when Bob Sweet and I were going through the agony of defeat many times, I always went to this quote. Success is not measured by what you accomplish, but by the opposition you have encountered and the courage with which you have maintained the struggle against overwhelming odds. And that's what all of you in this room do. Thank you very much.